Good evening. How are you doing?
Good. How about you?
I'm all right. I'm all right. Can't complain. Just getting everything set up. Looks like it is working as expected. Just give it a minute before we start. Don't want to surprise people by starting too close to on time. All right. Well, that's according to my counter, about a reasonable amount of lead-in time. So why don't we go ahead and get down to work? We are picking up in chapter 4, and we are in the home stretch for Masechet Beitzah, dealing with all of the issues of Yom Tov. Well, all of the issues of Yom Tov in general, not the specifics of each holiday. For that, we have to go to each Masechet as needed. Now, Chapter 4 is going to start us off with a question of what exactly, if something is allowed, is there a manner in which that it is allowed that must be adhered to, or is it just carte blanche? And this is something we've touched on multiple times throughout the Masechet, that the Chachamim, while recognizing that the Torah has given permission to do things that are needed for food, or indeed for the nefesh, for the person as a whole, that there should be limits, that it not just become a free-for-all and treat the day of a holiday as though it was a regular day. While not as strict, clearly, as the restrictions on melacha, on work, as you would find on Shabbat, there are still restrictions, even on actions that are permitted. So that's where we're going to start off with chapter 4, and we're going to see an example right after this question. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, what was that Hebrew word, melaha? How come it's not avodah or avod?
Well, that's a great question. So melacha is the term that is used in the Torah. And so by extension, it's the term that is used within Jewish law. But the reason why that word was used is probably because that was the word that was used in the Torah for the creation. When Shabbat is first being introduced, when it is first being established, if you will, at the end of the act of creation, it says that God rested from his melacha, from his work. Now, you're right. In casual Hebrew, we often hear the word avodah being used as work, but avodah might be considered job or some other term, whereas melacha carries with it a certain connotation of a particular type of action, a category of action. I haven't actually found a great English word for it yet, and if anyone has any suggestions out there, I would love to entertain them. But it can be variously translated as being the labor or work in a technical sense, like in a physics sense, but of course it's not limited to physics. As we'll see, there are some elements regarding exertion, but many other elements that do not regard exertion. So it's not how many calories you burn or how many watts of energy or horsepower you are producing or using. It is instead this term that in English doesn't have an equal parallel. But since it is the term the Torah uses both in Genesis and then later in Shemot, in Exodus, that is the technical term. And it's a great place to remind people that when it comes to defining melacha, what is a work action, a labor action that is prohibited on Shabbat or on Yom Tov, don't just go with your gut of what feels like work. A simple action like handing over a penny to the cashier may not feel like work, but it is prohibited. Whereas things that might be more calorically intensive, things that are going to exert yourself more, like walking to shul uphill in Florida weather, that doesn't count as melacha under most normal circumstances, of course. So it's not about the actual expenditure of energy or a particular amount of weight that's being moved or the indelibility of the action. Those are things that can get us in the range, but not precisely what it is. So it stands as a technical term. So melacha, usually translated as work or labor, and I'll probably use the words interchangeably as we go through. But yes, it is its own unique category, separate from avodah, as that is not the term that is used in the Torah for this particular prohibition. Not coincidentally, in my opinion, it's also found that avodah is not only a word for work in the colloquial Hebrew, but it is also a word for worship. It is the avodah of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, that is so central to the Torah and the ancient rites. So those acts are not prohibited, so it's probably good that a separate term was used. Okay, so one of the most famous forms of avodah, and now I see I slipped right into it. One of the most famous forms of melacha, of prohibited labor, is the transportation of an item from one domain to another. And that, as when we talked about Eruvin, when we did that Masechet, is a big deal because so much of life involves moving something from A to B. Well, on Yom Tov, we do have permission to move things from A to B under certain circumstances, most notably food. We are allowed to move the food around from place A to place B. However, here in chapter 4, we're going to see some limitations on that. One who carries jars of wine from place to place, he may not carry them in a basket or in a large basket, but he may carry them on his shoulder or in front of him. Similarly, one who brings straw may not drape a large basket over his back, but rather he must carry it in his hand. So these two prohibitions are not about the carrying itself. To move the wine, to move the straw from place to place is perfectly fine. But it must be done in a way that is not the most efficient, not the most business-like, not the most work-like, and that means you're not putting it into your giant back basket and carrying it as you would if you were schlepping the wine to the marketplace, but instead you're carrying a jar by yourself on your shoulder, and one at a time, and it's obvious that you're moving it for your use, not using it for a workplace use. So even though the transportation itself is permitted, there is a limitation on how we do it to maintain the special atmosphere and appearance of Yom Tov, of the holiday. Does that make sense? Okay. And one may start using a heap of straw, but one may not start using wood from the backyard. All right, so this backyard is technically called a muktzah, which causes no end of confusion whenever we study with it, because the word muktzah is also used for a category of items that are not allowed to be touched during Shabbos without special rules being followed. But here we're not talking about the category of items. We are talking about a special pen or designated area that is usually used for the collection of firewood. In the ancient world, of course, and really up into the modern world, wood was the primary fuel source used by most people in most places. As such, even if you were a farmer, you would most likely live in the town or at the edge of the town, and you would want to have the wood near your house, not out near the farm. And so you would have wood stored in your house, and you would have wood in the back, in this backyard, this muktzah area that would be set aside for eventually being used for your heating and cooking purposes. If you are in that situation, meaning if you are looking for a piece of wood, you can take from the wood that's in your house because it's already been designated as wood ready to go, but you cannot take from the wood that is in the back. The the wood in the back is considered to not be automatically designated. The straw, on the other hand, is considered to always be at all times ready to go because, well, straw is quite literally the essence of kindling, the essence of fire, and it is always going to be needed. And such, the straw is considered designate, as such permitted, as such you can use it. This wood in this area, you have not set aside, you have not designated it, therefore it is off limits for Yom Tov. Of course, you can designate it if you like, that's perfectly fine. The Mishnah here is dealing for a situation where you have not done that. Questions or comments on that designation difference? Okay. Mishnah 2, still keeping in chapter 4, obviously. One may not take wood from a sukkah, but only what is next to it. Now, the sukkah here may or may not be referring to an actual holiday sukkah. The word sukkah just means a booth or a hut, and these were common constructions, not only during the 1 week of the year when it is a mitzvah. So think of what a sukkah looks like, but you can divorce it from the actual holiday. So here we have the issue of, I've got a sukkah, it's a hut, it's made out of scrap wood. I'm going to be tearing this down eventually because it's definitely not a permanent structure. But on Yom Tov, I can't just take a piece off of it. And again, this doesn't matter whether it's a holiday sukkah or a regular sukkah. Holiday sukkah is obviously much worse because we need it for the mitzvah. But here we're talking even just about a regular sukkah, just a shady spot I've got. No. Why? Because if you yank the wood off of it, you are tearing it down. You are deconstructing it. And that is one of the prohibited forms of melacha, forms of labor. So taking the wood from the sukkah of any type, not allowed. However, if there was wood next to the sukkah, that is okay. That wood is generally considered to be automatically designated for consumption, for it to be used for fire and cooking. So that wood is perfectly fine, but not the wood that's being used, because that wood is, if you take it, you are engaged in the tearing down melacha, the tearing down form of labor, which is not permitted. Yes,
Rabbi. When is the tearing down form of labor prohibited because it's work? You're taking something from one thing to use it for another? Because I know deconstruction at some point in time is not considered labor, like opening a bag of potato chips.
Right. Destruction is not considered a form of labor under many different circumstances. Obviously, Shabbat is very complicated, but the act of deconstructing something in order to use the space, in order to use the pieces, in order to move it for some other purpose, that is an act of melacha, an act of labor that was associated with the building of the Mishkan, because the Mishkan would be erected and it would be unerected, de-erected, it would be deconstructed in order to move it from place to place. And all of the 39 categories of work begin by reference to the various activities that are connected to the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So that's the root for this deconstruction for a creative purpose to be prohibited. Destruction for destruction's own sake, meaning like I just want to open up the bag and to get to something. I just want to tear apart the loaf in order to eat from it. That everybody agrees is perfectly fine because you are there to destroy it, not to build in any way, shape, or form.
So, Rabbi, then my understanding, here's actually what I was getting at. It's not all right to tear down the sukkah to use the sukkah for firewood, but you could tear down the sukkah to access the firewood inside the sukkah.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by to act as the firewood in the sukkah.
Access. To get to the fire.
Okay, so you mean if the sukkah was built with like solid walls and you needed to like kick down the door kind of thing?
Yeah, if the door broke, it wouldn't open. You could kick it down to get to the firewood inside the sukkah,
but not the sukkah itself.
but not the sukkah itself.
I mean, I'd have to look at the specifics of the situation, but I can imagine a situation where yes, you could push through the sukkah to get to something inside, but not actually deconstruct the sukkah itself. But that's why there's an entire Masechet on Shabbat that deals with all of these forms of melacha in more detail. All right, so the next part of still in Mishnah 2, one may bring in from the field wood that is gathered together and from a karpef, an enclosure, even though it is scattered about. So again, we have wood that we know we're going to use, and we're allowed to go out and we're allowed to gather it. And likewise, that wood, as long as it's gathered together, meaning it's been set aside as this is firewood for Yom Tov, even though it's in the field, that's perfectly fine. Whereas if it is in the karpef, which has a more designated space, then even if it is scattered, you haven't been very tidy in your wood piles, you are allowed to take it because everything in that zone is clearly designated for immediate use. So even though it is not nicely stacked and piled or gathered, because of its position in that designated area, it is now fair game for Yom Tov. And what exactly is that karpef? We ask this question multiple times every time we come across this term. An enclosure next to the town. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi says, any enclosure which one enters with a key, even if it is only just within the Shabbat border. So there's a slight debate about exactly what counts as the this karpef, about whether or not it has to be right near the town or outside the town and such. But the general understanding is that it does need to be at least within the techum, the 2,000 amot, the 3,000 feet roughly, from the edge of the town for it to be acceptable. Meaning that Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be closer. Rabbi Yossi says it can be further away. But of course, they both agree it needs to be in that broader Shabbat range. And if you want to know more about that, go back and check out Mishnah on Eruvin. Mishnah 3. We're talking about wood and we're talking about chopping it now. Let's just get the introduction out of the way. One may not chop up wood, neither from beams nor from a beam which was broken on Yom Tov. So we can chop wood of some type. We have to do a little bit of that in order to get the wood ready for the fire, for cooking, etc. But we can't chop up wood that is not designated. And a beam, even a beam that broke on Yom Tov, which clearly now has no more purpose other than being firewood, these are not designated because we don't assume that at the start of Yom Tov, I'm going to be cutting up and using the beam for my fireplace. If it wasn't designated before, it cannot be used on Yom Tov itself. Beams, again, because they're thought to be useful, we wouldn't be thinking to cut them up. And the beam of my house, even though it's no longer useful, it wasn't designated prior to the start of the holiday. Thus, it cannot be used until after the holiday is done. And I can't even chop it up. One may not chop with an axe or with a saw or with a sickle, but only with the butcher's chopper. So even for wood that we are allowed to use, that was designated, it was in the karpef, whatever we're talking about, even that can only be cut up in a way that is different than the usual preparation. No going out in the backyard with your big axe and doing the lumberjack thing of splitting round after round after round. No. If you are going to use wood that has not been completely chopped up and ready for the fireplace, then you're going to have to cut it in a less efficient and less professional manner. Again, this is showing that the preparation here is being done for Yom Tov itself. It is not being done for stocking up the wood for the week to come or other reasons. And continuing with the same theme about things that are before or after Yom Tov, a closed room full of produce, which was burst open on Yom Tov. Let me just explain what we're talking about here. We are talking about a granary, essentially. They would often take rooms and fill them up and then seal them up, stack bricks in the doorway. And this was a way of creating a storeroom and making it less accessible to animals and such. Now, for whatever reason, that stack of bricks falls open. The produce is now available. What do? Well, he may take produce out through the breach, according to the rabbis. Rabbi Meir says he may make a hole at the outset and bring out the produce. So Rabbi Meir is a little bit more lenient. He says even if there wasn't a natural breach, even if it didn't fall open by itself, you still can actually remove the bricks because they weren't sealed in place, but merely stacked, and use the produce. The sages disagree, and they say, no, if it was set aside like that in a way, then you would be clearly tearing it down if you were pulling open the bricks, and that is not allowed, just as we saw earlier with the sukkah. However, if it falls down by itself, well, the food inside was always meant to be eaten, and as such, you are allowed to go ahead and eat it. You're not allowed to widen the breach. You're not allowed to do anything else, but you are allowed to go ahead and access the food that is now available, as long as you didn't deliberately cause that hole in the first place. Questions, comments?
I have a brief question.
Yes.
Is the reason this is different from, let's say, the cow is because I guess the food was already in a position to be eaten with a cow or whatever you'd have to transform to be eaten? Is there a transform element here?
It's still really more about the designation, the availability, and of course, when it comes to a cow, there is going to be another malacha, the act of slaughter, that would be required, and that is normally not allowed. I can't just slaughter my cow on Yom Tov if I'm not planning to eat at least some of it, which we talked about with regards to a sick animal. And with produce, that is not quite the same position. But the main issue here is one of the produce is sort of always considered to be at the ready. All right, Mishnah 4:4.
Can I ask that one more question then?
Oh, sure, of course.
So what about like stuff that's like picking fruit off a tree, or vegetables in the ground that just, let's say one falls? I mean, it's always meant to be eaten for the most part.
It is always meant to be eaten, but it hasn't been collected. And that collection is one of the malachot, and it's one of the ones that could easily be done before the holiday begins. And one of the other guiding principles is that any action that could have been done before the holiday without diminishing the quality or joy of the holiday should be done before the holiday. And if not, then it's not permissible on the holiday.
And one more thing, how come taking out a brick is not parallel to opening up a bag of chips?
Well, because in this particular case, the idea would be that it's too much of a building. And, one of the things that you will have to come to terms with is that exactly how to classify and designate different things is going to vary between different rabbinic authorities. As you could see, Rabbi Meir thought it was perfectly fine. Indeed, it's not really a wall. It's just a stack of bricks, and I should be able to open them the same way that I can open a cork out of the top of my bottle and pour from it. So that was his logic, which makes perfect sense. But the rabbis, on the other hand, said, yeah, it may not be a real wall, but it's real close to a real wall. And tearing it down, you really are kind of tearing down a wall. And that is going a step too far. You are engaged in a more constructive deconstruction rather than just a destructive deconstruction. So the arguments there, I think, yes, you can see that there are good positions on both sides. I mean, they are obviously the great sages, so none of them were idiots. But at a certain point, you end up with opinions that become the normalized interpretation. But into the modern world, those opinions then get reused and reinterpreted to handle new situations that our ancestors were unfamiliar with, like a bag of potato chips. So Mishnah 4. Now we are changing topics, obviously still on Yom Tov, but we are now talking about making a lamp. One may not make a hole in a lamp, that is to say, a lump of clay for use as a lamp, because that is making a vessel. Now, this one probably seems pretty obvious, but even though we know that you can actually light or transfer light on Yom Tov, and that is permitted, the act of taking a ball of clay and smushing it so it turns into a bowl, and then draping a wick over the edge, that is not allowed, because you would be making the vessel. And again, you should have done that beforehand, and making this lasting vessel is clearly forbidden on Shabbat. I find it very nice that this happened to work out, that we get to talk about making lamps on Hanukkah, but that's just a little aside. Likewise, one may not make charcoal on Yom Tov. Charcoal is not an accident. Charcoal is a very deliberate activity, and one that was very important for the ancient world. And doing things deliberately, staging where the different pieces of firewood would be laid in order to try and create charcoal, that is not allowed on Yom Tov, even though it could be sort of snuck in next to the general act of building that fire to cook your dinner. If you're doing it in a way that will create charcoal, which is a more usable long-term fuel source, then you are violating Yom Tov. And then we get one little loophole, if you will. And one may not cut a wick into two, but Rabbi Yehuda says he may cut it into two lamps using a fire. So picture, if you will, Rabbi Yehuda's way of making two wicks out of one, wicks, of course, being that special string for lighting in a lamp, is you put the two lamps next to each other, you lay the string between them, forming a little bridge, and then you light the string in the middle between the two lamps. It will light there, and as it moves towards the fuel source on both sides, it will naturally burn away the middle, and presto, you now have two wicks, one for each of the lamp, and you didn't cut it, the fire cut it. The lighting of the fire is perfectly permitted, because we know that from many other places, again, transferring the fire. But because you didn't cut the wick, it was a natural consequence of the fire, that was considered okay. Now, this is the normative position. We don't always see these singular opinions, but the Talmud does come down on the side of Rabbi Yehuda that, yes, in this very special way of having two lamps that are being lit simultaneously and sharing a string, and then the string naturally divides because of the arrangement, that is permitted. This because of the way the Talmud interprets exactly what Rabbi Yehuda is talking about, is allowed. If you were just to take a string and hold it over a flame and cut it in half, that would not be. All right, Mishnah 5. We're going to be continuing with things that are not going to feel familiar because they involve ancient cooking practices, but hopefully the principles will still be of interest and use. One may not break up a potsherd or cut paper in order to roast on it a salty fish. All right, so the best explanation that I could find in the commentaries was what they would do would be to roast fish. They would want to put paper or pot pieces over the top of the fish that would be soaked in oil. That would help make sure the fish was moist, kind of a natural dripping process to keep it in good shape. And fish many types can dry out very easily. This is a very sensible cooking technique. Nowadays we'd probably wrap it in paper and tin foil, but they were doing it in this manner. However, it is not allowed on Yom Tov because even cracking up potsherds, which might otherwise be allowed as a form of destruction, is not allowed here because you are doing so to turn them into a tool that will allow the the oil to drip into the fish. The same with cutting up paper. In order to use it in this way, you are cutting it up to make it into a tool, and as such, it is not allowed. It becomes a vessel, and that creation of the vessel is no different than the making of a lamp by depressing the clay. And one may not rake out an oven or a range, but one may press the ashes down. So obviously, all of these ovens and stoves are using fire and coal and charcoal, and that means there is a lot of waste debris. There is a lot of ash, and to completely clean it out would be the act of building it, of making it. However, shifting it from one place to another within the oven would be permitted, pressing it down so that there's good oxygen flow, etc. Now, as Dr. Kolb points out in the notes, Rambam does interpret this, as do other authorities, to be the first round of defense. But if the only way you can cook is to actually clear out all of the ash altogether, then yes, that is permitted. Yes, you should have done that in advance, but without doing so, you'd be unable to eat at all because no stove. And thus, one is allowed to use it and do it in that manner if it is a last-ditch effort. Other types of jury rigging that is not allowed, and one may not place two jars side by side in order to balance upon them a saucepan. So you have these two barrels or two jars, and you put them on either side of the fire, and then you want to put your pot on top of them, sort of making a makeshift stand for your cooking utensil. Not allowed, because you are making a stand for your cooking utensils. Sure, you're not bolting it together or gluing it together in a permanent fashion, but you are still erecting this structure in order to have that special stand for your cooking, and that is not allowed. Likewise, and one may not prop up a pot with a wooden wedge, and the same applies to a door. Now, we know that wood can be used for firewood, but wood cannot be used for some other purpose. This goes back to our idea that the permission that comes on Yom Tov is narrowly understood for the needs of the cooking and the sort of peripheral needs of the person around it. But using it to create a better cooking surface, using it to create a door jamb, these are not allowed because that's nothing whatsoever to do with the intent of the permission the Torah gave us. And one may not drive cattle with a staff on a festival, but Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, permits it. So here we have, again, this notion of, well, I know I can take a cow if I'm going to be slaughtering it or for such purposes, but by driving it with a staff, it looks like I am taking the cow to the marketplace. I am doing it in a business-like manner. Rabbi Elazar says it's okay because, you still are taking it for a permitted use, even if you're doing it in a way that looks a little businessy. It's not completely businessy. And like I said before, there are always going to be gray areas where different authorities will disagree on exactly how it should be interpreted. And likewise, in the modern world, there will be certain behaviors, activities that we might engage in that some may say are too much like a work-like manner, and others may say that it is simply the normal manner, and it's used in work settings as well. But that's because it's normal, not because that's associated so perfectly with just work. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, not to get off topics, but didn't Rambam, when he was updating the halacha in Mishnah Torah, didn't he update it to make it easier to perform work on these holidays, or is that just the intermediate days?
I would say for the intermediate days, there's some of that, but it's important that Rambam never thought of himself as updating the halacha. He was compiling and organizing the halacha in his own mind. Yes, he made decisions and interpretations, but that's what any rabbi has to do. The difference was he wrote them all down, so they became more widely followed and understood. But he never thought of himself as modernizing for his generation the halakha. He was simply distilling it, taking all of the bits and pieces from Mishnah here, from Midrash halakha, from the Talmud, from the Gaonim, from other rabbis that came before him, and sort of homogenizing it to make it more coherent and more understandable for everyone. That's one reason why Rambam's Hebrew is so beautifully clear, because that was his intent. It wasn't to give you the subtle flavors of the argumentation, but to be precise and technical in its language. But updating, I don't know if I would go quite so far as to say that. We are going to, not probably today, we will talk about some updates to halakha a little bit later on. We'll see how far we get tonight, but go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I thought the reason Rambam didn't cite to a lot of his work is because he wanted to make it easier to make some changes. And I thought a lot of them was pro-business changes, with him being kind of at least tangent to a merchant at one point in time.
I hadn't heard that. I mean, his brother was definitely a merchant before he died in a voyage. But I hadn't heard the interpretation that he didn't cite in order to make it easier to slip one past the people. The general understanding, that as far as I was taught, was he didn't cite, one, because he didn't need to. If you asked him, where did you learn that, he could take the book and show you, meaning that the citations were all there mentally. But two, because he was, in his introduction, saying this explicitly, trying to get away from those other pieces of work. He didn't want people to be reading the Mishnah or the Talmud or the Gaonim readings unless they were going to become rabbis and great scholars. But for the average person, they didn't need the footnotes. They just needed to know what was allowed and what was not allowed. And too much citation and too much discussion would confuse them. Rambam was, in modern parlance, very much an elitist. He was someone who earned his position in the elite, but he definitely had a low opinion of the average person, but he did want them to still be able to perform the mitzvot correctly. And he wrote the Mishnah Torah with that in mind. At least that is how I have was taught to me, and what my own subsequent reading about Rambam has continued to reinforce. But if you have a citation about the idea that this was partly a business ploy, I would love to hear that, because that's an interesting take. All right, Mishnah 6. Get this lined up. Come on. Sometimes I really want to just adjust that mouse wheel a little bit. Rabbi Eliezer says, a man may take a chip from that which is lying before him to pick his teeth with it, and he may collect chips from the courtyard and make a fire, for everything in the court is prepared for Yom Tov. So Rabbi Eliezer is sort of picking up on the topic we had before and saying, if someone, sees a bit of wood on the ground, he can use it to pick his teeth. It's, a toothpick for him. That's perfectly fine. He can even collect the ones in the courtyard and make a fire. He had a very broad idea of what it meant for something to be prepared for use. Just being in the courtyard was perfectly fine. It didn't have to be designated or even distinguished from other pieces of wood for it to be prepared, as long as it was in your immediate property zone. But the sages say he may collect only from that which is before him and make a fire. But you cannot just go around and collect everything, get a giant broom and sweep everything up. That really, it's what is already designated, set, and laid out ahead of time. That is what is usable. And the other stuff is not. If you know you need more wood, designate it in advance, which of course is the general upshot, of all of Mishnah Beitzah. If you want your holiday to be the best holiday, you have to do some planning and preparation before the holiday. Don't just wait until Sukkot or Pesach or Shavuot have begun and then say, oh, wait, what am I going to eat? What am I going to cook? How am I going to cook it? What am I burning it on? that is going to make your holiday worse. Set things in motion in advance. Mishnah 4:7. One may not produce fire from either, let me use his translation. One may not use fire either from wood or from stones or from dirt or from water. So this is talking about lighting the fire itself, initiating the fire, striking the match in the modern world. We've talked about this point obliquely many times over Beitzah, and also when we went through Shabbat, that one, of course, is not allowed to start a fire. However, on Yom Tov, one is allowed to transfer a fire. So if you already have a burning candle or oil lamp, as they would have used, you can take and light a taper off of that and move it over to another oil lamp, and that new oil lamp can then be ignited. But you cannot sit down and bang two rocks together. You cannot take the little wood sticks and rub them together to make the fire. The water is generally understood that you would put water in a glass and then use it basically as a magnifying glass. The dirt, I haven't seen great explanations of this, but oftentimes there were composting type things and lye and lime that could create a thermic reaction. It doesn't matter how you're trying to ignite the fire. Igniting fire is not allowed on Yom Tov in any way, shape, or form. We may be allowed to use it, but we are not allowed to light it. So that is a very important principle, one that continues to this day. You buy a long-lasting candle, about yay big or so, depending upon which brand you're getting. You light it before Yom Tov begins, and now you have a ready source of fire to light other things that are needed. So that is perfectly permitted, but you cannot strike the match from scratch on Yom Tov itself. Questions or comments? Okay. And yes, this is one more example that the Mishnah was not written in order to lead us through the topic, but written just as a collection of the ideas about the topic, or else we would have covered that some time ago. Nor may one make tiles red hot in order to roast on them. So this idea here of taking a piece of clay, heating it up in the oven, and then taking it out and putting something on top of it to sizzle on it like a roasting pan, that is not allowed. Not because roasting is the problem, but because the tiles in particular are being finished. They are being heat treated when you do this. And so you are actually building something in the form of the tile, turning it into this finished product. If you want to do this with a piece of metal, if you want to do this with a piece of stone, that's okay, but not with these clay tiles. Rabbi Eliezer further said, a man may stand near his muktzah on the eve of Shabbat. Remember, this is the back zone where you'd have things stored. On the eve of Shabbat in the sabbatical year, and say, from here I will eat tomorrow. But the sages say this doesn't work unless he marks it out and says, from here to there. So we've talked about designating before, and now we get a little bit more of the argument over how the designation works. Rabbi Eliezer believes that as long as you just say, I'm eating from here, that's okay. The sages, however, say you cannot be that broad. You do need to limit it a little bit. There needs to be an actual area of this shelf, these baskets, that barrel. That is what I'm eating for Yom Tov. There needs to be more than just I'm eating out of the warehouse. So that's the argument there. Now, why is this being talked about with regards to the year of the sabbatical? Well, because during the year of the sabbatical, there isn't the same need for doing a tithing, because it's not your produce. It is generic produce because nothing is owned by anyone during the sabbatical time. So therefore, the requirement to tithe is not operative, and just making a broad declaration of, I'm going to eat out of this warehouse would be perfectly fine. So basically that inclusion of the sabbatical year is trying to say, I'm not worried about tithing. I'm saying you can just eat from all of the warehouse if you want. The sages are not arguing about that, but they do argue that it needs to be more narrowly designated than just out of this warehouse. Let me just scroll down so people can see more of Dr. Kolb's commentary. Any questions? All right. I'm thinking that, what time is it? Because there's only what is it, 7 Mishnayot, I believe, in chapter 5, which I think we'll be able to handle quite nicely next time. So I'm thinking, you know what? Let's go ahead and leave chapter 5 for next week. That will allow us to finish Masechet Beitzah right before the Gregorian New Year, which has a certain nice completion feeling to it, and that will give us then a chance to prepare for the follow-up Mishnah. If we start chapter 5 now, we're not going to finish it, and then we would only have about 20 minutes worth of study for next week, and I'd like to have it be a little bit more balanced between the 2 weeks. So we finished chapter 4 today. We'll pick up with chapter 5 next week, and we'll finish tonight, 13 minutes early, I guess it is.
Thanks,
So I hope everybody is having a wonderful Hanukkah, and keep lighting those candles. Remember, of course, as you come up to Shabbat, we light Hanukkah before Shabbat, and we light the Hanukkah after Havdalah Saturday night. That Hanukkah is a bookend to Shabbat itself, because obviously we're not lighting on Shabbat once Shabbat has begun or before Shabbat finishes.